Welcome to the Fretboard Journal podcast. I'm your host, Jason Verlinde, the publisher of the Fretboard Journal magazine. That's John Rauhaus playing in the background. And today it is my distinct pleasure to share with you a truly incredible conversation that I had with John Monteleone. If you are listening to this and don't know who John is, let me just say he is one of the greatest guitar makers of all time. His guitars fetch six figures regularly. His archtop guitar designs are pretty much peerless, and he is just an all-around incredible human being. Don't take my word for it. There's an entire documentary on John called The Chisels Are Calling. You can watch that on Amazon Prime. Mark Knopfler himself wrote a song called Monteleone that you can check out, and Ben Harper's Winter is for Lovers album was recorded entirely on Ben's Monteleone lap steel guitar, something that he commissioned from John himself. John's a legend, and during this conversation, we're ostensibly getting around to talking about this incredible museum exhibit that's taking place right now for most of 2024 in Long Island, celebrating John's output with a truly staggering array of his guitars that he's been building over the decades on display. But we also talk about so much more. I ask him about starting out, how he finds inspiration, his workshop, learning from Jimmy D'Acquisto, finding his own voice, and so much more. John was really an open book. I really appreciated this conversation. And John's just having this incredible year. In addition to this monumental museum exhibit that is basically a family reunion of all these instruments he'd made over the years for various clients, John is also having his Art of the Guitar Festival August 1st through 3rd. I'm going to be there. It's on Long Island in Stony Brook. And I know a bunch of great musicians are going to be there. Lawrence Duber, Anthony Wilson, Martin Taylor, Frank Vignola. It's going to be amazing. So I talked to John about all those things and so much more. If you enjoyed this conversation, I should remind you, we are a reader-supported magazine. We appreciate you subscribing at fretboardjournal.com. You can click on that subscribe button and join us. We also have a Patreon. Our Patreon followers saw the video from this interview in its entirety about a month ago when I first did it. And last but not least, we have our Fretboard Summit taking place in Chicago this August 23rd to 25th, 2024. One of the names mentioned by John is going to be there, Jonathan Stout. Matt Munisteri is going to be there, Joel Patterson, a whole bunch of great archtop players and builders, including Megan Wells. And I would love to see you there. You can go to fretboardsummit.org to sign up. This is a different festival than any other guitar show you've ever been to. I don't know how else to explain it. This is basically a 3-day, full day, fully immersive guitar festival where you can try out great guitars from builders. You can meet many of the people you've heard about on this podcast or read about in the pages of our magazine. You can geek out with some true authorities, and then you can see mind-boggling music all night long. It's incredible. You will not want to leave the Old Town School premises that the festival takes place at. And it's a truly special thing. And I don't know how else to describe it. It's like summer camp for guitar fanatics. You will love it. I hope to see you there. fretboardsummit.org. Please sign up, register as soon as possible so we can wrap up our planning and know exactly how many people are coming. And if you have any questions, of course, shoot me a note, podcast@fretboardjournal.com. Before we get to that, a reminder, our friends at Stringjoy Strings now have not only acoustic and electric guitar strings, they've got mandolin strings and 5-string banjo strings now. Use the discount code FRETBOARD when you check out to get a discount. Peghead Nation, where the aforementioned Matt Munisteri is one of the many great instructors, is sponsoring the show once again. Our friends at Collings Guitars and Mandolins are sponsoring the show. When the Fretboard Journal first began 19 years ago, we wanted to be the Collings of guitar magazines. And that stays true to this very day. We love partnering with Collings. I cannot wait to see what they have in store at our Fretboard Summit. They always unveil something cool. Please follow them on Instagram and Facebook. iZotope has their new RX11 software, and they're also having their big summer sale right now. So if anybody needs a great deal on their plugins, please go check out their website. And then last but definitely not least, Seattle's own Mike and Mike's Guitar Bar are sponsoring the podcast once again. An incredible store right here in Seattle, Washington. I love going over there. I love hanging out there. I love that they have a full service repair shop right next to their store that is fully staffed and always taking guitars that need a little TLC. Follow them at mmguitarbar.com. Like I said, our Fretboard Summit is just shaping up to be this magical, monumental, once-in-a-lifetime weekend. Adam Levy's going to be there. Colin Hay, Blake Mills, Joe Henry, all these incredible musicians, Molly Miller, are coming to teach you, to play music for you, to field your questions. It's going to be truly amazing. And then we've got all these great brands and experts and authorities. And one day we will get John Monteleone out to Chicago. Mark my words, he'll lead an architecture tour or something cool. The other big news I just want to share is our 54th issue is out now. It's mailing to subscribers everywhere around the world. If you've never seen the Fretboard Journal, it's a keepsake quarterly magazine unlike anything else in the guitar space. We feature long-form interviews and in-depth articles and beautiful photo essays, and we celebrate folks like John Monteleone in every issue. I hope you are a subscriber. Please subscribe at fretboardjournal.com. And now, without further ado, here is my conversation, and it's a good one, folks. Share it with your friends with the one and only John Monteleone. John, thank you for being on the Fretboard Journal podcast again. An honor. I try not to bother you too much because I know you have a tremendous backlog of guitars to get through. But we have a good occasion today. This museum exhibit at the Long Island Museum. Before we get to that, though, I'm guessing there might be some people listening to this who don't know your background, don't know your story. I'm reminded of you almost every day because I'm on Facebook still, and it serves me an ad. And a local person to me here in Seattle is trying to sell a 1925 TB4 Gibson banjo that I guess you put a neck on back in the old Mandolin Brothers days.
Yeah.
1971, he said in the ad, at least.
Uh-huh.
Was that a big part of your life, making banjo necks and retrofitting stuff that Stan J found?
Well, yeah, that goes back to a time pretty early on. I was shortly out of college. I graduated in 1970 and was half-heartedly looking for a music teaching position. I had gotten my degree to teach, and so I was substituting while half of the time working for my father and his business at that time. So when I met Mandolin Brothers, I'd met them on the radio one night as I was carving away at one of my little personal guitar projects that I was building in my upstairs bedroom where I had my workbench. And so I would listen to the radio at night. And I heard this radio show, and the guests on it was like a folk music program, and the guests were Hap Kuffner and Stan J, and they were talking about their new business, and which was going to be called Mandolin Brothers. And so they were talking about this new idea of buying, trading, selling vintage fretted stringed instruments. And that rang a bell with me right away. So I was paying close attention while they were inviting people to call in. And I think I called in. What I do remember is calling them the next day to talk about a mandolin I saw in my town locally, the Gibson. And I wanted to know more about it. And I said, this would be the perfect introduction. So Stan answered the phone, and we talked a bit. I told him what I was doing in my bedroom. And he thought that was interesting enough to invite me out and there to his house, where their first showroom was in his living room, Mandolin Brothers. So I drive out to Staten Island, and I bring some of my projects, my guitars and things to show them. And so they were impressed enough to hire me right away if I was interested in doing all the repair work, the restoration work, setups, and all that sort of thing, because by that time I knew how to do that kind of thing. And I accepted immediately. You know, it was a door that just opened right then and there to something that was so familiar to me in terms of a career that I hadn't yet to know anything about, that was even possible. So here the door opens, and in the living room there, he's showing me master tone banjos and Pearl Martin guitars and a couple of nice mandolins. And so this was the bare bones beginning of Mandolin Brothers. And I was there at the beginning. And also in the room was Mark Horowitz. And Mark Horowitz was an amazing five-string banjo player who lived locally there. And so I got to meet Mark, and he instantly hired me to make a five-string neck for one of those master tone banjos. And I'm not sure if that's the very same banjo, but that sounds pretty early. I don't know about 1971, probably 1970, late 72 or into 73 maybe. That would seem to make more sense. Nonetheless, I would go on to make these five-string replica necks with Gibson on the headstock, everything, right to the last detail, to make them into RB3s, RB4s, double eagles. I did a 5 and also a 6, RB6. They were all coming at me around those early days, and that helped me to really establish the early part of my career. And what followed that would be all the guitar stuff. I was going home driving in my little 63 Volkswagen Bug on the Southern State Parkway here. I had about an hour's drive, praying that I wouldn't break down, because on my back seat was maybe a D45 or a triple O 45, or maybe a Bella Voce banjo. There was all this crazy stuff that was happening so fast. Crazy good.
This sounds like the Wild West of vintage guitar collecting and restoring and repairing. Were you kind of flying by the seat of your pants and learning as you went, or was this knowledge out there and Stan J coached you a little bit, or how did you know what to do?
Well, I was able to put it together pretty logistically. I would approach these instruments for what they were and what they were showing me. As I would work on them, I was learning. So that was my university right there. That was my education. And it was up to me to solo at that, because nobody else was really qualified in those days to share that information with me. So the history of the companies themselves for Gibson and Martin and Gretsch and et cetera, there was no hardly any published information on the collection of those instruments, the cataloging of those instruments. All of that stuff was happening at one time, and it was all growing live, so to speak. So having access to the instruments was the greatest opportunity to learn at warp speed what I could learn from them. It was so exciting. How could I not? I was looking at stuff that I'd only dreamed about, or I thought maybe one day, possibly could I afford to have one of those? Well, no. And that was always the reason why I had to make it for myself. So I would make the guitar that I couldn't afford to buy, So all of that fed into this frenzy of learning. And to me, when I look back, or I talk with other people about that who are interested in doing repair work, I said, man, you got to find the biggest assortment of junk and mediocrity, failure and success, beautiful instruments, the best to the worst, anything in between, and you begin to tear it apart. mentally, you can kind of look at this thing and you become very good at assessing what the instrument is. As you begin to work on it, you also begin to understand the personalities of the maker. You begin to see their thumbprint. And the thumbprints of those companies would change from the teens into the 20s, into the 30s, 40s, 50s, right on up. About every 10 years, you would see this kind of an attrition of factory workers, let's say, who were talented. The workforce, I mean, these were made by not one person, but they were made by a group of people who were trained to do these procedures and these various assemblies of the instruments based on the tooling that they have, the templates that they have, the recipe that they have, and keeping those templates alive throughout the years would be one of the problems you could see on, let's say, if you were look at early Martin guitars and into the golden era of the 30s, where everything is just right, up to World War II. And then things changed right then and there when those same people are not coming back to the workforce and things change. Nobody replaces the tools. They begin to wear out and all that. And at the same time, the public demand for these instruments would also change in terms of popularity, in terms of musical trend. So one thing would be following another, so to speak, the instruments, the music, the musicians. So that would go over time. You would begin to see that in the instruments that were crossing the workbench. You could follow that history. It was like reading a book. It was amazing, And then as time would go by, you would learn, books would be written about it. Other people would take up the interest and the history. And sure enough, I'd be reading the history and I'd say, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about folk instruments or, pre-war banjos and flat top guitars. Was it at Mandolin Brothers where you really became enamored with the archtop?
I was familiar somewhat with archtop guitars growing up in my location. There were venues close by where you would see a wedding and you would see the wedding band, the orchestra. It'd be like a quartet would be playing. The guy sitting in the quartet would be a guitar player. And what's he playing? Probably an ES-175, that kind of thing. So I was aware of that. And then when I was 12 years old, I got to see my first Angelico up close and personal when a local guy, musician, I spotted him near my dad's shop. He would visit his wife on his way to a gig, and he'd pull out a brown case and carry it in. And being the kid that I was, with big eyes and a curiosity, I ran over to him and said, "Hey, that looks pretty cool. Your guitar, can I see it?" "Yeah, sure." And he would show me. And it was an ES-175. He says, "Yeah, you think that's cool? Wait till you see what I'm getting." "What's that?" I said, "Well, this guy in New York City is building me a guitar." "Wow, can I see that when you get it?" "Yeah, sure." So a few months go by down the road. Guy comes in in his 59 Impala convertible, pulls out a brand new brown case, and I ran over there immediately and said, "Is that it?" "Yeah, you want to see it?" He puts a case on the ground, opens it up, and there is this blonde New Yorker, 1959, and the lacquer just wafted up into your face. It was that new, And the thing was golden, man. It was like, wow, that's amazing. And So that kind of stayed in my mind for quite a while. Then with Mandolin Brothers later on, what happened in between those years with folk music for me. So I got involved with folk and all that, but I still had my third ear was out to electric guitars, and this ear over here was tied into my piano, and this other ear in the middle of my head was tied into everything else. It was crazy. So at Mandolin Brothers, they were beginning to get these Angelicos and really nice Gibsons, some Epiphones, interesting Gretsch or something would come in. And the idea that the Angelicos needed to be set up properly was an exciting idea to me. And I was already making mandolins by that time. So there was a closeness enough in the construction to be exciting for me to have the idea to build my own archtop, which happened in 1977. Yeah, 77. Built the first archtop Eclipse, which I still have. And it recently came back to me after being out in the world for a while. And so, yeah, that's where I got to see all these great and fabulous guitars. And I would end up these years having a little collection of them of my own.
Yeah. 1977 was the first archtop for you?
77 into 78, yeah.
Is that at the museum?
It is at the museum.
Okay. And building that, and it maybe shouldn't go without saying, but you're an accomplished musician. I got one of your CDs when I visited you, or a CD of your first recordings. Did that first archtop turn out the way you wanted it to?
Actually, it did. It was an influence, clearly an influence of D'Angelico and Gibson L5. That combination, I was trying to, in my mind, pick out the essential goodness of each of those. I didn't want to necessarily make a D'Angelico, but I knew in my mind I could probably do that. Same as I did with the mandolins. And I made replica F5 mandolins. I call them M5s. But my earliest mandolins said the Gibson in the headstock. And I think there was about 8 of those that went out into the world before I figured out, hey, why am I making their mandolins?
Yeah.
Excuse me? So, and at the time, it was sort of a brave idea to put your own name on. And so I was kind of testing both ideas by going down both roads at the same time. So I was making the Gibson thing, and then I made the same mandolin with Monteleone on the headstock and seeing if it would go.
Mm-hmm.
And it went. So I changed from then on, kept my name on the head.
I bet the minute you put your own name on the headstock, it also kind of opens some doors of like, I don't have to do exactly what Lloyd Loar designed.
Right. Well, what I realized from the very earliest days was that you're up against tradition or traditional expectation in terms of design. And, this makes me think about Jimmy D'Acquisto when he was making guitars just like D'Angelico's. Because that very idea, he was making guitars that was expected of him, and that would be John's guitars. So I remember talking with Jimmy about that idea, and he was, before he changed to his breakout design evolution there, he would complain about that idea. He said, boy, you guys, you luthiers, you can go out there and build your own guitars. But me, I got to make these goddamn D'Angelico guitars. That's what they want from me. And so he was upset about the idea. And then he would go to our symposiums that we would have, where all the independent luthiers were showing their stuff. And he got invited one time, maybe more than one time, and to be a guest speaker. And at that time, he got to see what all we were doing. And I think that really encouraged him to go out and take a chance. And so he did. He had ideas. He would always talk about ideas when you visit his workshop, about some theory that he had about tone, or about the bridges, or about the sound holes, or that kind of thing. And he saw what we were doing, and I think that encouraged him, which in turn opened the door for us, because he was basically at the top. He was the top man on the totem pole. And so he was brave enough to go down that road. And we said, hey, that's cool. And so that was inspiration enough, I think, certainly for me at the time, to say, it's okay. You can do this. But the underlying idea, and the thing about Jimmy too, was that he was a good guitar player. He was a musician, and he had that natural connection to the guitar, whereas D'Angelico did not. And D'Angelico, as far as I know, he knew how to tune the guitar and maybe pluck a note or two, but he was not a guitar player. So Jimmy was a pretty darn good guitar player, and he was a gigging musician as well. And so he knew enough about the performance of the instrument and the foundation of it, to always be an instrument that is responsible to the music. Mm-hmm. And that idea stayed with me, certainly, in that you have a foundation upon which you can build a guitar. But there's moments during the building process where you can breach that idea. You can breach the foundation irresponsibly, really. And so I would always come back to the guitar itself. And, the importance is, how is it going to play? How does it sound? How does a musician like how it plays? How does it feel? The tonality of the instrument, the blend, the note, how does it speak? How does it respond? How does it touch? So all those kinds of things were what I was listening to musicians who I could rely upon for that information. So that was a beautiful connection that happened with some people during my process of learning, which, by the way, still continues. I'm always learning. That never stops. And that was all a big part of the ball of wax of education for me.
I think a lot of guitarists and guitar collectors, especially of a certain generation or younger, our eyes light up, our ears open when you start talking about hanging out at the Diaquisto shop, and just, that just seems like, wow. I know your guitars are original, but how much of how you patterned your workshop and your work day is influenced by what you saw him doing, or maybe saw what he was doing wrong? Like, how much of the mold did you follow there in terms of, like, I'm going to make this many guitars per year like Jimmy, or not? Like, talk to me about that.
It's a funny thing about that. You just brought up a memory of, back in the very early days of growing up, you would have the record albums in front of you, and you just study those photographs, and that's what I did, right from the early days. I said, I think I can make that guitar. I mean, I want that guitar, but I can't buy it. But it's made by human hands. I think I can do that. And so the idea of absorbing the visual idea, the visuals. I would look at D'Angelico's photos or photos of his shop, his workshop, which thankfully a close guitarist Ray Gogarty, in fact, was one of John D'Angelico's customers, but Ray happened to be a photographer as well. So those black and white photos you would see, they're out there now, but back in the day, I think only I had them from Ray. And then I began sharing them with magazines and books and stuff. So that's what's out there. But in those photos would be a pretty good idea of what his workshop looked like, you know. And I had never visited D'Angelico's workshop, although I was I was 17 years old, 16, 17. I just got my license, and I had it in my idea to go drive into D'Angelico's because I heard so much about him, and I was using his strings on my guitars at the time. And I said, I got to meet this guy. And I was all geared up to meet him when he passed away. So I never got there. But I would meet Jimmy years later. And his workshop was photographed by Tim Olson of the, Tim. And by that time, I was working on his guitars, Jimmy's guitars, but Jimmy would send D'Angelico's to me because he didn't have the time for it anymore. So he would send those guys to me to go repair or restore their guitars, which was great for me to get the experience. But it also set up that connection to Jimmy, which was a friendship based on the guitars themselves, which was a wonderful thing. So I would go see his workshop, and I would watch him build things sometimes. And to respond to your question, I had it in my mind to be an observer, but not a copyist. And this is the same thing when I got to be friends with Mario Macaferri. I would go visit him, and just for the privilege of being there, I was not going to interfere with his style. I was not going to advise him. I was going to share the happiness of just being there. In my own mind, though, I said, I probably wouldn't do that the way you're doing that. But I wouldn't tell them. That would be for me. So those were ideas I would come to through my own experience of building the instruments. That's the thing about building instruments. You develop a style of building. You develop a way of approaching your tools. You know what they'll do in your hands. The tools are extensions of your hands, really. So that becomes a thumbprint, like the thumbprint I would see in John's guitars back in the day. Or I'd open up a Gibson, whatever it was, and I'd see it in there. Same with the Martins. I'd open them up and work on them and say, wow, I could identify those guys at the time. And so that's an interesting observance that I think these days it's a little harder for people to have access to, like I did back then. It was so easy to have these instruments. But when guys tell me and say, "Yeah, I want to repair guitars," I want to build guitars. I said, "No, back up. You should learn how to repair them first. You can't beat that experience for coming to understand the real essence of the instrument and what it's supposed to do. That's it. It's a real simple idea." I say, don't go out and build a New Yorker. No. Don't go out and build a fancy schmancy whatever it is. No. I said, go copy an L5 or an L7 or not an L10, but a 7 or a 5. Copy that guitar. See how close you can come to it. Because the most basic idea is wrapped up in those guitars to start with.
Your archtops today fetch some of the highest prices imaginable for a 6-string guitar. looking back on those early days, were there some lean years where you actually had trouble selling your guitars?
Oh yeah, of course, yes. Um, and that's why I kept building my standard model, which was basically a simple idea, simple instrument, maybe a little bit of the upper end touch on them, but they were not what I would refer to later as presentation style instruments. If you look at a D45 or a 0045, an OM Deluxe, those were presentation guitars, really, based on the simple D28 or whatever that was, a 0028. And so there again, you take the foundation and build on it, and you can continue the idea with ornamentation. And that idea came to me in a way that I could have a little fun with the basic instrument by developing somewhat of a thematic detail, like the Radio City guitar, which came out of the Eclipse. The Eclipse was, the basic archtop guitar, which has its roots in the L5 or the Angelico Excel or New Yorker. But to take it the next step was very interesting to me. And then the Radio Flyer was the next one as well. So these were paying homage to the guitar and their role historically in performance, in the great music halls of the world, or the greatest. And then the radio itself, all the great guitar stuff that entered my head via the radio. And so I was tipping my hat to those ideas thematically. And that's kind of where it grew from into the Four Seasons guitars, which became a personal project of mine to start with. I knew nobody else was going to commission that set of guitars, but it had to be a group of 4 guitars from day one, because there were 4 seasons. Kind of like Kevin Costner's new movie out there now. It's 4 movies. It had to be 4, not 1. Okay. So you know that from the beginning. And so then that was my own personal project that other people got to see being built. And then after they were built, they got to hear them because I had commissioned a piece of music for that group of guitars, for the quartet, which was, I guess, a unique idea. Nobody had ever done that, to my knowledge. But I had always heard the music for those guitars from the beginning and knew there had to be music for them. And so other people were seeing this, other guys who were collectors who really appreciated the high end and the presentation style and the thematic ideas that I was coming up with. So that's where they might come to me and say, "Hey, how would you do this? How would you make a New Yorker?" And so I would come up with design my own New Yorker style, which, loosely based on my past history with them. And then the idea to make the Monte Cristo, which was a tribute guitar for in Jimmy's honor. Mm-hmm. And so these projects were coming at me, and I'm still an independent one-guy mm-hmm. workshop. And to my advantage, that it worked so well for me, and still does, because I can turn on a dime and go make another project at will. Yeah. I don't have to support, or be responsible for a crew behind me, how to train them, how to work with them, blah, blah, blah. So independently, I always could go at my own speed with any project I wanted to do. And so as a result, there would be about 5 different projects going on at one time in rotation of maybe the Sun King, maybe the teardrop guitar. A guy would come to me and say, "Hey, how would you make a teardrop guitar? What would that be like?" Okay, let's do it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and those guitars, by the way, are at the museum.
How many guitars these days, roughly, do you build in a year?
Not all that many, I'd say. I've kind of slowed it down a little, but only a little. So I would say the average was maybe 8,
Mm-hmm.
8 guitars. And back when I was making mandolins, it was more than that at the time. I could make easily 12 to 14 maybe of mandolins in a year, while juggling all this other stuff. Even repairs back in the day. I was still doing repair up until I think somewhere in the 90s, maybe late 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to draw the line and say, I haven't got time for that anymore. I have to build. That's it.
Yeah. And of the 8 or so guitars that get commissioned every year, how many are new customers versus repeat customers? I know you have a whole legion of fans who want as many Monteleones as they can afford, but are there new people finding you even these days?
The answer is yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I've got 1, 2. Right now, I have 2 new people. I'm working on projects right now.
And new models coming still?
Well, yeah. Okay. So, I'm having a little fun with that. And because in recent years, I started building a few more personal instruments for my own little collection. So I would build a 12-string archtop because I always loved 12 strings. And one of the earliest DeQuistos I ever saw was a 12-string that he made. And I was so impressed with that idea. I said, one day I got to make one of those. And so I made the Midnight Special, which turns out to be the last of the limited train series edition that I did. I built 10 different guitars based on trains, famous trains, or train-related ideas. And that was the last one. So the Midnight Special, it's a big 18-inch 12-string. And then I built Scarface, which is based on all of the imperfection spruces and maples that I'd collected over the years. They would have maybe a knot or some kind of ugly line or some nasty thing going on in there. But the wood would be so good that I put it aside. So it could either be a black guitar or some other thing. I said, okay, let's celebrate the idea. Scarface, and so that's one. I just finished one based on a wildcat called Pantera. And I've got the next one in line behind that is the Lion.
Okay.
And then have Calypso, is almost done. It's on my workbench. So yeah, I mean, these ideas are easy, man. The time is just not there to do it all.
What is the Wildcat? Is that a cat eye sound hole, or is that something completely different? Or you don't want to tell us?
Well, specifically, I never thematically designed specifically for a theme. I like to leave the imagination in place for the musician or the viewer or the listener. So there would be maybe little suggestions of something that could play into the idea that might trigger that connection. Same idea is when I was building the side sound holes into my guitars from 1990, what, 4, 5, the first one. The first one with side sound holes opened up like an Easter egg. It opened up the inside of the guitar to look into. And I said, hey, now there's another canvas that I can use to continue that connection thematically to what you see on the outside of the guitar. So therefore, I would, like the Four Seasons guitars, for example, would have related design drawings or inlays on the inside of the guitar. If you look into them and say, hey, wow, there's this connection. So, yeah.
Yeah. You seem to be just there's just this joy, and maybe this comes from you being in a rarefied place in Lutherie where you don't have to necessarily worry about your next commission, but you seem to have this joy and adventurousness. Obviously, you didn't even mention like the Ben Harper guitar that you made that we featured. Is it important for you to take breaks from guitar making so that you can be excited about guitar making and come at it with fresh eyes and not feel like you're just, nose to the grindstone?
Answer is yes. I to this day, every day, I take about an hour or two to play my piano. I have a beautiful Steinway 1908 grand that I restored, 25 years ago. But I play that piano every day. And for me, it's my music therapy. It's and for a guitar or any musical instrument, for anybody who really is into it, that is therapy. It's music therapy. So for me, that's kind of like my therapy. And I do, like to get away from the shop, even though the shop is like, 100 feet away from my house. I'm kind of like always there. But I'm always there with pleasure and with excitement, It's so exciting to collect in my mind what I did yesterday. If I walk back in, it's like so exciting. It's like I can't wait to see that, or wait to take the clamps off of it, and see how it's going. Is it going to live up to my expectation of what I'm hearing from day one? What I'm hearing about that guitar, So that's really the fun and rewarding process. And I understand, if you're not under pressure to do that, it's more liberating. And thankfully, I've been blessed with a clientele that always extended me that freedom to do what I could do, because I think they understood that if they gave me the time, that it would pay off,
Yeah.
And I think that idea works.
Certainly. Walking through your workshop, which I was lucky enough to do last year, one of the things that was remarkable for me was that it felt a little bit like this living museum. You're one of the few guitar makers I know who has guitars from various points in their career. I think I saw the 12-string. I know I saw the 12-string archtop that you just mentioned. I walked through and thought, John should be charging admission. Like, this is like, the Mario Macaferri stool over here. Everything you've kept so much. Thinking about this museum exhibit that's happening right now, 2024. How did you decide what ended up in the museum? Did they do all the work? How much of your personal life is in the museum? Talk to me about how this all came to be.
Okay, so the museum came to me. They approached me with this idea for the exhibition a few years ago. And it's an interesting thing about museums when it comes to, and I saw this too with when we did Guitar Heroes. I saw it as an opportunity to bring a piece of history, the guitar history, the mandolin history, maybe the banjo, the whole thing is a part of Americana. history. And that's an opportunity to really do it right. And also to do it wrong. So the mistakes can be made along the way. Because I found that it was necessary to be on hand as an advisor to give them guidance at their own request, to be there for them, to help them learn about what this is and what that was and where did it come from and who made this and how many and whatever. So there was a lot of information that they would need to catch up on. So they would come for this exhibition. Joshua Ruff from the museum came over and spent time in my workshop to see what it was that I was building. He also got to see what I had for my own collection here. And he began to formulate a kind of a history based on what's somewhat chronological. And he thought it would be good to show from my earliest days up to present, what I was doing. So as a result, he put together a list of 48 of my instruments, and some of which came from my own collection, but largely they came from other collections outside. So there is 48 of my guitars and mandolins and other assorted pieces at the museum on display. It's quite amazing to wrap my head around that idea alone. I'm deeply humbled by it. But it is the only, as far as I can tell, the only assemblage of that many instruments that we're going to see.
I mean, there's nearly 50. Do you have any sense of your total output at this point? How many guitars you've made?
Yeah, right now it's upwards of 204, 230, but in mandolins it's over 220, I guess, or somewhere up there. So, total it up, we're over 400 and maybe 50 or 60.
But that's staggering. I mean, that's a huge percentage of your guitars in one place. This is like a once in a lifetime thing.
Exactly. Yeah, it's amazing how these people were so kind and generous for loaning the instruments that they did. So they'll be there until October 13th.
Yeah, and there's some celebration going on at the end of July, if I'm correct, right?
Yeah, we have a few performances. Jonathan Stout will be performing.
Lovely.
With Eric McIntyre together. I'm really looking forward to that because, it just speaks, they can speak so much to that great era in the 30s of the acoustic archtop guitar. And so you're going to hear some amazing duets, guitar duets, which brings to my mind Crescent McDonough and George Van Epps and those kinds of things. So that'll be a nice experience. Buddy Merriam's going to perform with his band Bluegrass, and then we have, in fact, this week Chico Pinheiro is going to be playing with the screening that we're doing of the film at the museum. That'll be this week, and then in September we have the coming together of, three of the four original guitar players on the Seasons Guitar Suite. And because the Four Seasons guitars are now on loan from the Metropolitan Museum, they are there also at this Long Island Museum, and they're going to be played in performance in September.
I love it. I love all of it. Are there bits of mementos, personal objects, non-guitar things at the museum as well, or is it focused mainly on the instruments?
Um, it is mainly on the instruments and that whole idea, what they are, where they come from, how they got there. But I think in the explanation of things, it's important to lay out the future of potential for instruments themselves and for the music. And I think based on the musical past for these instruments, let's say acoustic fretted string instruments, and all the associations of other instruments and musical styles that we know about, what are exposed to us, it really comes around and always speaks to the human connection to that musical instrument. You know, this is, it's part of the soul, the musical soul, the ability to express emotion through vocal or voice or through instruments or a combination of anything around that idea. And I think that simple idea, even after going through all the different accoutrement that you can wrap around the idea of how music is performed and popular trends and all the other things, it always pairs down to that same old thing, the simple connection of just picking up an instrument and it's so simple, it's so old, but it still works. And so with that in mind, the future, I think, is pretty safe, I think, for having gratification and satisfaction through plucking a string. It's an amazing thing.
Do you have younger builders come to you the way you were able to with Jimmy or even Mario Macaferri? Like, do you have people come and make a pilgrimage and just try to soak in your energy and whatever they can glean from you?
Yes. I've had a few. I try to pick and choose, but I've had people come and do that very thing, to be interested. And if they show a genuine interest, I'm happy to give them the time. Same as when I do workshops. I've done workshops mostly in Italy. It's my beautiful excuse to just go to Italy and enjoy the experience. But at the same time, I can bring together some very focused students of mandolin or guitar making, and I can get together with them and share with them my approach to building, my approach to carving a soundboard, my ideas of tone. So I use those basically as clinics to share information based on how they do. I can see their work. I encourage them to bring their building projects, as well as a chunk of wood that we can have fun with and carve and make sawdust. So those have been very, very nice and rewarding experiences. And a few of those students have gone on to do quite well.
Lovely. Do you think it's easier or harder to make a living now as a luthier than when you started? Like, if you had to start over today, would it be as rosy?
No, yeah. I don't think so. The timing was right. I think, for a lot of growth and development and early seed planting. And the industry of vintage guitar collecting and buy, selling, and trading, and how independent luthiers fit into that idea. I think in the early days it was easier in certain ways. The luthier was up against tradition for quite a while, until, let's say, I'm thinking probably the mid to late 80s, going into the 90s, when some of these luthiers were becoming pretty well established. And then with the internet and all of the books and information were now being put out there, the industry was beginning to change. It changed for the dealers as well. It seemed to be that there were more experts, that naturally you would expect with the succeeding generations. Yes, of course, anything has to grow to keep its interest and to keep fascination and create a drive and an energy for just pursuing these ideas. But now you have access to not only information, but any of the tools that you need. The internet provides huge gallery. So it's way different than it used to be. I remember kind of like before Stuart McDonald and a few other places, you had to make all your own stuff. You had to make all your own tools, basically, and be creative. And this is one of the things that I think the Guild of American Luthiers played a good part in, and that there were other people like me out there who were new to the game, and they began sharing information of how to do this, how to do that. Here's how I do that. Here's how I do this. And then here's how you do it, and you can do it. And so some of the more difficult procedures and things, or machines or tools, those ideas were being kicked around and shared freely. Back in the day. It's funny because I think about this because my father, who was trained classically as a sculptor and became a pattern maker, and that was, I grew up in that environment. But for him, the idea of information sharing was something you paid for, you went to school for. So he had trouble seeing how guys like me and my friends were sharing this information freely and publishing information and putting it out there. He didn't grasp the idea too well. And but I said, we're living in different times. These are different situations. It's to our advantage to share this information. And I think in the earlier days, the old days, they were concerned about being ripped off, and I don't think that was our problem necessarily.
Yeah, I feel like you generally keep a pretty low profile. You're not on Instagram every day. You're not reaching out to me, but for the last 5 or so years, there's just been this ongoing beautiful celebration of you and your instruments. Obviously the Chisels Are Calling movie that's, I think, on Amazon now. Anyone can stream the documentary on you. There's the Knopfler song. I mean, there's this amazing museum exhibit, which goes through October 13th. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. Does it feel like you suddenly have a lot of attention looking at you right now?
Well, I understand what you're saying. Yes, of course, it's obvious, but I kind of step back. I'm able to put all that kind of like in a place. I almost look at it as from an outside, you know, an outsider looking in on this guy. I'm able to separate it. I'm able to put it on a shelf, and that enables me to just go back very simply, go back to my workbench and have fun chiseling and carving away and making sawdust and all that stuff, which was the original idea in the first place. So all this going on around me is amazing, but I try not to let it play into my mind at all. I don't. You know, I'm incredibly thankful for it, and I'm deeply honored by it. In fact, these things have happened I could never have dreamed of. You know, dreaming about it would have been existential. It would have been like too far away from me. But the realization of what it could be, I could accept that. You know, I understand it. And maybe it helps feed me into the idea of that idea is being successfully appreciated enough to propel me onward and keep on going. You know, I feel good. I'm ready to carve. You know, I've got a huge chunk of Hawaiian koa sitting on my workbench, ready to carve out into an archtop, which I'd never done one of those, but that'll be fun. You know, so yeah, I got stacks of wood just staring me in the face, you know, if not hypnotizing me because of the amazing curl on them or whatever they're showing me. So yeah, I can't wait to have at it. You know, the rest of it is amazing, and I enjoy it. But it's cool. It's cool.
I love it. I love hearing your enthusiasm still. That's so cool.
Yeah, I know.
All right, John, I am going to see you next month. Coming to New York. I want to see this exhibit. Everyone listening to this, if you're anywhere near New York, should go. I mean, it has to be probably the most valuable exhibit the Long Island Museum has ever had, given what your guitars go for.
Their insurance policy will reflect that idea, yeah. I want to make mention, too, of another event that is totally separate from this one, the museum. I have my own guitar festival. Mm-hmm. It's called The Art of the Guitar. And it's a 3-day festival that happens this year. It's going to be on August 1st, 2nd, and 3rd at the venue called the Jazz Loft. And just coincidentally, both events happen in the same village of Stony Brook, Long Island, New York, only within a mile walk from each other. So you can visit both things. Well, if you happen to be there for the festival, you can certainly go down the street to the gallery. Even in the same village, right between those two events is the Long Island Hall of Fame, which presently is a Billy Joel celebration going on there. So there's a lot going on. There's great restaurants, by the way, all around there. So, I mean, if you go there, you can make a day of it. No problem.
I love it. I'll include a link in the notes for anyone who wants to learn more about that as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
John, thank you. As always, it's a joy talking to you, and a history lesson as well. And if you ever want to leave Long Island and come to our guitar event in Chicago every August, open invite.
Thank you. I'm always, I'd love to do that. I know about that event, and I've always wanted to get there, but for some reason there would be something in the way.
You got a busy year, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's very busy this year. Next year, I think I'm going to lay back.
Okay, good. We'll drag you out then.
Oh, I'd love that.
All right.
Well, it's always a great pleasure talking with you. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you, John. It's a privilege. Thank you.
You're welcome.
See you next month. All right, that was my conversation with John Monteleone. It was good, right? I hope you enjoyed it. I learned a ton. I could talk to that guy for hours, but I feel so guilty that I'm pulling him away from the next great guitar he's about to build. Stay tuned, everybody. We have more interviews lined up. Subscribe to our podcast if you haven't yet on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. And thanks, as always, for tuning in to the Fretboard Journal podcast. It means the world to me. Till next time.